Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I am Bill O'Brien. It is a Tuesday, the 7th day of April in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you again today. This is 2 days in a row, and we will be back again tomorrow for our third broadcast of the day. Tomorrow we will be beginning at our regular time, which will be 1 p.m. in the East. And as you know, on Tuesdays, we begin 1/2 hour late. So it's just gone 1:30 here in the Eastern time zone. Welcome to the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for your willingness and your faith in us to provide programming that is worthy of your valuable time. I appreciate that very, very much. We invite you to participate actively in our program by calling in. I appreciate you being here, but I know that those listening would love to hear your ideas and your thoughts on some of the issues we've been dealing with. I'm going to begin today's program with a little bit of a review or overview or summary, if you will, of what we did yesterday, because very honestly, I really believe that what we did yesterday is quite important. And it's one of those things that I thought it was when we were going in. I had a plan. I kind of thought I knew where we were going and how issues were going to connect. At the end of the program, I was more aware and appreciative, actually, of how important the issue is. And so I made up my mind not too long after we went off the air yesterday that I did want to begin today's program with an overview or a review or a summary, if you will, of what we did yesterday, because I do believe it's significant. And if you have ideas, thoughts, concerns, questions, comments about yesterday's program, I would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one via email, my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, at gmail.com. If you recall yesterday, if you were with us yesterday, and if you weren't, then this is a summary of the program. But if you were with us yesterday, and this summary does spark a comment or a question or an issue that popped into your mind yesterday that recurs to you today, by all means pick up the phone and give us a call. We would all enjoy sharing in that. What we looked at yesterday, and again, I really think it is quite significant. We've been looking at the issue of the initiative surrounding the calling, an effort to call a constitutional convention based on the strategy of amending the Constitution of the United States by adding a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. That's the premise. And a number of states have signed on and requested that such a convention be called. We are moving towards 30 states. When 34 do it, then the Constitution, Article 5, says that Congress shall convene such a convention. So in other words, and I think Hamilton makes this very clear in one of the Federalist papers, actually in Federalist number 85, Congress has no choice. If 2/3 of the states request the convening of a convention for purposes of considering amendments to the Constitution, Congress has no option but to call such a convention. At this point, there are, I believe, 27 states at least as of a week ago, there were 27 states who had signed on requesting such a convention for purposes of amending the Constitution with a balanced budget amendment. And one of the things we covered in our programming last week here at the Virtual Center was the role that the American Legislative Exchange Council, known affectionately as ALEC, one of the roles that ALEC has been involved in is streamlining the process for calling such a convention. ALEC, in fact, on its website has a formal application so that the applications sent in by the states will all be the same. Therefore, there'll be no way that anybody could question the legitimacy of the state requests for such a convention. In other words, there is a uniform procedure for requesting the convention and wording the request. And ALEC is responsible for this because in the past there have been questions because there were changes in the way different states worded their request. And those who are opposed to a constitution in the past, convention, in the past have used these differences in wording as justification for not enlisting or accepting every state's request. So ALEC addressed this by establishing a formal procedure, and in fact the House of Representatives adopted legislation, the Republican-controlled House, in 2012 in order to set up a procedure for receiving requests. In other words, this initiative to convene or call a convention under Article 5 for purposes of amending the Constitution with a balanced budget amendment is not something that has happened suddenly. This is a well-conceived, well-thought-out, well-planned, well-organized initiative. And it is well-funded as well. As of last week, there were 27 states that had signed on. So we're getting very, very close. This is a very, very relevant issue. What we've done here at the Virtual Center is look at the founders, specifically at Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, and Madison. And indeed, we did include a letter from Jefferson as well. We looked at some of the sources from the founders on the issue of a second convention. And the point I've been making is that the founders were very, very skeptical, very, very much opposed to the convening of the convention. In fact, Madison was so opposed that he became an advocate for a Bill of Rights for the convention as a way to short-circuit the request for a second convention. In other words, his argument was that to convene a second convention would probably destroy all of the progress that the Constitutional Convention had made. By putting the Constitution back on the table again, you were basically sabotaging the progress that the Constitutional Convention has made and the Constitution that convention was able to draft. So concerned was Madison about the threat of a second convention that he began to advocate a Bill of Rights as a way to seek an alternative to the second convention. In other words, for those people who signed on to the second convention because they believed the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights, Madison said, okay, we will commit to the idea that one of the first businesses of the new Congress will be to design and to send out a list of amendments that will constitute a Bill of Rights. Madison was the leading opponent of the need for such a Bill of Rights during the Constitutional Convention. He became the loudest advocate for a Bill of Rights once the ratification process was underway. The reason for his shift was because he began to realize that the Constitution might indeed be in danger if a Bill of Rights was not added, even though he didn't believe one was necessary. And there's no question, a major source of his concern about the future of the Constitution was the threat of a second convention. He was horrified at the idea of a second convention, and he therefore became an advocate of a Bill of Rights in order to undercut and short-circuit the move toward the support for such a second convention. We've been looking at that issue, and I've been raising serious questions about this. And one of the issues that concerns me deeply is the degree of funding, the degree of organization, the agenda of those who are pushing for the second convention most adamantly, most loudly. It is clear to me from the research that I have done that the balanced budget amendment, while ostensibly it is the reason for the move toward the convening of a second convention, the fact of the matter is, I think the evidence supports the fact that the agenda of those behind such a move for a second convention goes well beyond the idea of a balanced budget amendment. They want to eviscerate, emasculate the Constitution of the United States in terms of the structure of government as it currently exists. They want to basically reduce the size, the significance, and the influence of the federal government and return a lot of the power which the Constitution shifted to the central government back to the states as it existed under the Articles of Confederation. And consequently, many of the other amendments that these groups have put forth as being amendments they would support suggest to me that their thinking goes well beyond the balanced budget amendment. To assume or to conclude that if a convention is indeed called for purposes of a balanced budget amendment, to assume or to conclude that the convention's business will be limited to consideration of that one amendment only is an illusion. And the fact of the matter is, those pushing hardest for it know that. Their agenda clearly goes way beyond the balanced budget amendment, and their efforts to try to reassure the wary that the convention would not be a runaway convention, I would suggest, is an illusion. They want a runaway convention. They want a convention that will consider changes well beyond the idea of a balanced budget amendment. Although, as I mentioned, the balanced budget amendment, even by itself, it seems to me, would emasculate the republic as we know it, because it would literally render inoperative the ability of the federal government to govern in the public interest. In yesterday's program, we continued this consideration of the second convention. And basically, we focused our attention on Federalist number 49, the 49th Federalist paper written by James Madison. In that paper, Madison spoke very, very clearly about the dangers of an amendment convention, based principally upon the people who would sit in a convention. He talked about the fact that the most adamant, the most ideological, the most devious, in other words, the very people who are pushing hardest for the second convention would indeed end up sitting in it and would probably end up running it, Madison predicted. His argument is that the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state constitutions developed at the time of the American Revolution were developed in an environment which was optimum for promoting deliberation, negotiation, and compromise. His point was that the pressure of the war for independence made cooperation and the willingness to negotiate and look toward the bigger picture and unanimity as a priority for the states. It was the ideal situation for constructing constitutions. But Madison pointed out that that constitutions developed in the best of circumstances are not going to happen in the worst of circumstances. Chances are that those pushing hardest for a convention, Madison believed, were those who had agendas. They were ideologues. They were political demagogues, if you will. And Madison made the point in Federalist number 49 that it would be wonderful if we were a nation of philosophers, if we could rely on the fact that every citizen understood the Constitution, read the Constitution, knew exactly what was happening, thought through the issues, and voted accordingly. But the fact of the matter is, Madison pointed out that that's an illusion. What we do know as fact, Madison said, is that most people operate, although he didn't use this term, from what we call today a herd mentality. Public opinion is easily swayed. Public opinion is easily manipulated and controlled by ideological demagogues who get people to think in support of their particular agenda, their particular issues. Madison's point is that when individuals are thinking and acting as individuals, they are careful, they are considerate, they are timid, and they are careful. But the fact of the matter is, when they are voting as a group, when they know that there are a lot of other people who believe and think the same as they do and want the same things they want, they become victim to what we call a herd mentality. They're easily manipulated, they're easily organized, they're easily led. And the people who lead them are the very demagogues and those people who are most in favor of amendment. These are the people that are most adamant in favor of a convention. And Madison says, except in the most ideal conditions, when circumstances like the pressure of war promote compromise and negotiation, you do not want to put the Constitution of the United States in the table and subject it to change when the situation is dominated by party and ideology and partisanship and personal private agendas. In those kinds of circumstances, Madison said, you don't want to subject the Constitution to any change at all. What our agenda on yesterday's program was about then was looking at today's contemporary political situation in this country. Who are these people promoting a second convention? What are they after? What do they want? And what we looked at was an article in Easter Sunday's Washington Post by Colbert King, in which he is laying out examples from state after state of absolute unwillingness to compromise or to go along with the initiatives or the right of the Obama administration to govern. King quoted a bill passed by the Republican-controlled Arizona legislature, House of Representatives in Arizona, which made it illegal for anyone in the state of Arizona or any subdivision within the state of Arizona to support or to go along with any administrative policy decision coming out of the Obama administration, coming out of the White House, unless it was approved and voted on by Congress. In other words, the state of Arizona voted to effectively nullify, render null and void any administrative decision that the president and his administration might make, or any of the administrative agencies of the Obama administration might make, like the EPA, for example, made it illegal for the state to go along with anything that a Republican-controlled Congress did not vote to support. In effect, what Colbert King is pointing out is that there are examples of open rebellion against the administration and the person of the particular person sitting in the White House right now, President Obama. This is not the kind of an environment which is conducive to a constitutional convention when there's open rebellion going on against the administrative policies of the central government. And what King points out is that those people in Congress, those people we would look to and expect to take on, to challenge, to address this rebellious situation going on within states, specifically naming Senate President, Majority Leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, that in fact Mitch McConnell is initiating much of this rebellion. He has written op-ed pieces in the the Kentucky newspapers, urging states to refuse to go along with EPA decisions on energy, on climate. He has encouraged the states to oppose UN efforts. He has injected himself into the ability of this administration to conduct both foreign and domestic policy. Literally, he is challenging the right of the President of the United States to govern as president. So rather than looking to the leadership in Washington to address and resolve some of these issues, we find that for political reasons alone, the people who ought to be challenging and seeking ways to meet effectively these challenges are in fact instigating them. Clearly, this is not the kind of environment in which a constitutional convention ought to be meeting. What Madison is spelling out in Federalist number 49 as to the dangers of a second convention apply very, very specifically, very accurately to our present circumstance. The fact that we are moving so close to the call for a second convention in this kind of a highly partisan, highly charged, incendiary political environment in this country is extremely dangerous. We are literally playing with fire. We are literally at the point potentially of risking the future of the republic itself. That effectively is a summation of our program yesterday. That in effect, Madison's warning in Federalist number 49 is so appropriate and so visionary in terms of the political situation we are confronting in this nation right now, that his advice from Federalist number 49, that this is not the kind of political environment when you want to be calling conventions to amend the Constitution of the United States, is right on in today's world. And that's the point that I wanted to make in yesterday's program. Madison's prediction in Federalist number 49 is visionary. There's one issue I kind of touched upon yesterday, but I wanted to kind of reiterate today before we get off this summary of yesterday's program. And specifically, it is the criticism of Madison's position in Federalist number 49 based on the fact that Madison is taking issue with Jefferson. Jefferson proposes a procedure in a draft constitution for the state of Virginia, which would make the convening of constitutional conventions for the state of Virginia much easier and much more efficient and predictable. Specifically, Jefferson was proposing that when two branches of government come together and agree that constitutional change is necessary, then those two can initiate the call for a convention to amend the Constitution in question. Madison takes that proposal apart in Federalist number 49. And those who support republicanism, who support popular government, and support Jefferson's support for popular government, are very, very uncomfortable with Madison's position in Federalist number 49, because Madison seems to be taking the side of government against the people in number 49. Despite the fact that Madison is so concerned about abuses of political power in most of the Federalist papers that he authors, that he writes, in number 49, he's much more supportive of government and the stability of government, much more supportive of the ability of government to reject the will of the people when it's clear that that will is being manipulated by ideological demagogues. In effect, what Madison is saying in number 49 is that despite the fact that he has this tremendous respect for Jefferson and this tremendous respect for Jefferson's support for Republican government and for the consent of the governed and the ability of the people to be the ultimate source in the drafting of constitutions, they need to be brought into the picture, Jefferson is arguing, whenever the issue of constitutional amendment comes up. Madison's position is that's true, and he supports Jefferson for that. But at the same time, he said we've got to be very important, very careful, because unfortunately it happens that people are not thinking all the time. More often than not, people are susceptible to being herded, to being manipulated, to being controlled by artful, ideologically driven spokesmen whose agenda is not always on the up and up. So therefore, Madison raises questions in number 49 about the need to make sure that the Constitution is protected, is shielded from these kinds of situations. I am suggesting very clearly that we are in one of those situations right now. It seems to me, given the circumstances we face in this nation right now, in terms of the open rebellion against the Obama administration, open rebellion against the White House, open rebellion against the ability of the administration to govern both domestically and internationally, and the extent to which this opposition, this insurrection, is being orchestrated and led and supported by congressional leaders on the Hill who ought not to be engaged in these kinds of things. In other words, there's a treason issue associated with this, which we won't get into now, at least from my perspective. The fact of the matter is, I think the current circumstances we are in renders Madison pretty much correct in the position he takes in number 49. Those who support Jefferson, those who support the will of the people against government, those who buy into the traditional idea that the greatest threat to the liberty of the people is government, and Garry Wills, I would suggest, is probably the name that comes to mind right now in terms of those who think this way. His opposition and criticism of Madison for number 49 is based on the idea that this is out of character for Madison, because Madison is usually on the side of the people and on the side of limiting and controlling and regulating and managing the power of government. Madison is usually not in favor of rendering government immune to the will of the people. But in number 49, he takes that particular position. And Garry Wills takes Madison to task because of his opposition to Jefferson in this particular context. I would suggest to you that Garry Wills is coming from the traditional idea of hostility and contradiction between the powers of the people and the power of government. Garry Wills is coming with the idea that you always must control and regulate government and keep it under wraps so that it doesn't become abusive of the people's freedom. The fact of the matter is, what Garry Wills is unaware of when he writes this 35 years ago is a situation where government itself is potentially becoming the victim of highly funded corporate interests who have a vested interest in weakening and emasculating the republic as it currently exists for their own agenda. They are funding the efforts of the takeover in state after state of political novices, many of them associated with the Tea Party, who owe their election, owe their offices to the money being funded to help them win these seats. They have no political background. They have no political experience. In many cases, they have no political insight. The one thing they do have is a commitment to do everything they can to dismantle and disgorge and disengage government. In other words, the one theme that they all have in common is this anti-government mentality which seems to define the Tea Party. These are the people that the American Legislative Exchange Council and other organized groups funded, highly funded by corporate interests in this country. These are the people who have been elected to office in these states. These are the same states that are now signing on for the convening of a second convention, which ALEC and its supporters are orchestrating and managing and coordinating and organizing. This is a conservative effort to emasculate and eviscerate the republic as we know it. Under the circumstances we are in, Madison's Federalist number 49, it seems to me, is quite appropriate. And we would do well to heed the warnings that Madison gives us in number 49. That's really an overview of yesterday's program. I hope I did it justice, because I think that the program, the issues involved, are very, very important. I hope I was able to make that case. I think the timing is right. I think the overall significance of the insurrection that is going on in this nation against the ability of government to govern is testimony to the wisdom of Madison's warning in Federalist number 49. I think we are there. I think we are living right now in a period which Madison was visionary enough to foresee. In this particular case, Madison believed and said in number 49, this is not the kind of environment that you want to subject the Constitution of the United States to amendments. You don't want a constitutional convention in this kind of a highly charged partisan political environment in this country. But we are getting close. I think the issue is here, and I think we would all do well to keep an eye on what's going on and do everything we can to thwart it. We are at 5 minutes after the hour. We have a little bit less than 1 hour left in today's program. Because we do have an abbreviated program today, I don't think it's necessary that we take our regular 5-minute break as we usually do at the top of the hour during our 2-hour broadcasts. I think we can probably move right on today. But I do, at this point, as we move from this topic into yet another one, I would say that this is, if there are people out there listening who have ideas or suggestions or concerns or commentary of any kind on this particular issue, then I think now is the time to make yourself heard. We have a phone number. It is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you do have a commentary on this issue, Federalist number 49, the idea of a second convention, the idea of a balanced budget amendment, whatever, then by all means, I think all of our listeners would appreciate hearing from you at this time. If you're a little bit reluctant about getting on the air, but you would like to express yourself to me personally, then I would recommend that you send me an email and get your ideas down. I'll do the very best I can to answer you, to respond to you as best I can. I want to encourage you to do this because I welcome your ideas. I welcome your thoughts. And if your email does contain things that I think the rest of our listeners would do well to hear, then I would appreciate your willingness to let me share with our listeners. I won't identify you, but to share with our listeners the commentary and the ideas and the suggestions that you would make on this particular issue. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. There are a number of issues I mentioned yesterday when we were kind of looking forward to the week, to programming for the week. There were a number of issues that I've been involved in over the last week, 10 days or whatever, reading I've been doing, research that I've been doing, articles that I've been reading. I wanted to share with you because I think they are so very, very important. One of the issues that I'm particularly interested in is reaction to and the significance of the study of capitalism that came out last year in a book by Thomas Piketty called Capitalism in the 21st Century. It has taken the world of economics by storm. It was written and published in France in 2013. It came out in French. Piketty obviously is a citizen of France. He is an economist. He wrote his book in French. It was published in 2013 and became so popular that it was translated into English, German, and other languages as well. It has become a hot item. As of January 2014, Piketty's book has sold over 1.5 million copies. It is a 600-page book on economics. From what I have read and heard, it is becoming the kind of book that everybody feels like they ought to have a copy of, even though very, very few of those people actually sit down and read the book from cover to cover. It is full of charts and graphs and research. It is loaded with data. Piketty's book is getting unbelievable accolades from a variety of different sources. Now that it's been out for a while, well over a year, the criticisms of Piketty's research are piling up. There are a number of people, a number of critics, who have something to say in criticism of Piketty's book. But what is becoming very clear as you survey the critics is that while there are specific criticisms of some of the conclusions and some of the findings that Piketty reached, the fact of the matter is nobody is questioning the depth or the value of his research. Piketty has done the kind of research job on economic development in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries and into the 21st century. He's done the kind of research and compiled the kind of data which even those most critical of his conclusions have to admit is valuable research and worthy information. I think that's extremely important to realize. There have been in the past a number of other studies in different areas which have produced similar results. One of them, of course, is Karl Marx. I think it is very important to recognize, and I think all of us know this, but I think at this point in time it seems warranted to repeat this. While so many people have had so many complaints and so many charges of opposition, so many issues, so many things that they take issue with in Karl Marx, the most disturbing thing to many people about Marx is that while there are critics, nobody has successfully been able to refute the research and the insights that Karl Marx has presented. People don't like him. People don't like his results. People question some of his conclusions. They challenge some of his conclusions. They resent some of his conclusions. But at the same time, Marx is so substantive in his analysis, in his understanding of the nature and operation of capitalism, that it's very, very difficult to refute him. You can challenge him, you can disagree with him, you can argue against him, but you can't prove that he's wrong. Totally. That seems to be the category that Piketty's book has moved into. You can disagree with him, you can argue with him, you can not like him, you can reject portions of what he concludes, but you can't question the validity and the depth of his research. His conclusions and his findings are based on hard evidence. And while you cannot like the conclusions, you can't really refute the evidence. Even the critics are complimentary of Piketty. Just as the critics, the serious critics, I don't mean the ideologues, I mean the serious critics of Karl Marx have been of Marxism over the years. You can take them on, you can not like them, you can argue with them, you can do all of those things, but you can't reject the depth and the substance of what he has contributed. In American history, it seems to me, we have, and I think we've covered this in some time ago here at the Virtual Center, you see the same kind of things with the writings and the research of Charles and Mary Beard. Charles Beard's Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1913. Historians went crazy. Lovers of America and believers in the idea of individual freedom and all the rest of it. In other words, those who believed without question much of the rhetoric associated with the history of the Republic were taken aback by Charles Beard. Beard's suggestion that the Founding Fathers might have had personal gain in mind in their support for certain elements and aspects of the Constitution of the United States was so uncomfortable, so distasteful to many people for so long that people screamed and hollered and stomped and complained and criticized. But the fact of the matter is, nobody yet has been able to disprove Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution. They've been able to point out that there are other issues associated with it which must be taken into consideration, but nobody has been able to totally challenge, totally refute the depth and the substance of research. They've questioned some of the research and said it hasn't gone deep enough. Some people have argued, Robert Brown is the person I'm thinking of, that if you really do the digging and you go further into the sources than Beard was able to go, you begin to dig up some data which suggests that Beard was wrong in certain of his conclusions, because he didn't go far enough. He didn't collect all the evidence. There's a lot of evidence that exists that we know about now that he didn't know about. But nobody's been able to just decimate Charles Beard any more than they were able to do so with Karl Marx. This seems to be the category that Piketty's research has moved into. While people question it, very, very few people have been able to refute it. I would like to spend some time today, and obviously tomorrow in our program tomorrow, looking at the issues associated with Piketty's research and its significance. In other words, what is there about Piketty's research that is caused 1.5 million people to purchase the book? A book of charts and graphs and data and substance research. Much of it information in the area of economics that an awful lot of these people wouldn't even understand. So the reality is that many of the people who bought the book aren't reading it, or haven't tried to read it, or can't read it, or don't want to read it, or whatever. But they want to have a copy of the book because it makes them look good. It makes them look current and up to date. I've been spending a lot of time in the last week to 10 days collecting information and research about Piketty's book. I have yet to purchase the book itself. I'll be honest with you, part of the reason is the cost. The cost of the book is $25 or so, which is quite high. But on the other hand, everything that I'm reading and everything that I'm doing suggests that I'm going to have to buy this book because it's that important. And I'm going to have to make a stab at wrestling with some of the data in it because that data is so very important. Why? Because it deals with an issue that I believe is the most pressing, the most telling issue in our world today. And it is the tremendous increase in inequality in today's economic world. Inequality worldwide is on the march. The gap between those who have and those who don't have is expanding faster, and the gaps are greater than ever existed before. What Piketty's research has led him to conclude is that inequality is innate in capitalism. Inequality is a part of capitalism. Capitalism itself produces inequality, Piketty has concluded. Therefore, as long as you continue to practice capitalism, you are going to continue to experience the increase in inequality. And if you insist on controlling inequality, on reducing inequality, then that's going to require active involvement of government. It's going to involve government taxation and literally the redistribution of wealth in order to offset the inequality which capitalism generates. This is very uncomfortable to people. Obviously, it's very uncomfortable in our society because so many people are committed to the idea of free enterprise in the purest sense. The idea of unregulated free enterprise capitalism. The idea that government is the enemy of free enterprise. And that the more regulatory role government plays, the more you are tampering with the beauty and the essence of capitalism itself. What Piketty has done is suggest that unregulated capitalism breeds inequality. And the result is that if you don't do something to regulate it, if you don't do something to redistribute the results, then you are going to end up with fewer and fewer people controlling more and more of the wealth, and larger numbers of people being forced to scramble for the crumbs. In other words, if democracy as we know it is going to survive in conjunction with capitalism, then government's role is not to be expendable. Government's role is critical. Therefore, if you are engaged in this ideological struggle to emasculate government, to attack it, to keep it from functioning, to defund it, to render it inoperative, so that capitalism can function unmitigated, unregulated, uncontrolled, then you are going to have to live with the inequality that results. And eventually, you're going to have to deal with revolution. Because eventually, the many on the short end of this economic stick are going to say enough, and they are going to rebel against the system, which is giving them less and less and giving the few more and more. In a sense, many of the things that Piketty is concluding are the things that Marx concluded. However, there's one major difference between Marx and Piketty. It's not often talked about, but I believe all of us need to be aware of it. And that is a major difference in attitude towards capitalism between Marx and Piketty. The fact of the matter is, Marx was an opponent of capitalism. Marx's analysis of capitalism was an effort to explain why he believed that capitalism ultimately would destroy itself. That the structure, the internal structure of capitalism was such, Marx argued, that capitalism was doomed to destroy itself. because the redistribution of wealth and income that capitalism required was going to produce so much in the hands of so few that revolution was inevitable. And of course, Marx's idea is that when the revolution happens, what he believed would be pure communism would come out of that revolution. That the overthrow of capitalism and the overthrow of the capitalists, those who would exploit the labor of others for their own benefit, once they were gotten rid of in the revolution against capitalism, then government would represent the people truly, rather than the few. In other words, Marx's prediction was, Marx's agenda was support for the world that would follow the demise of capitalism. Marx believed that the demise of capitalism was inevitable. The principal difference between Marx, the theorist, and Lenin and Stalin, the political operatives for communism that we know about, is that Lenin and Stalin believed that there was nothing wrong with helping the revolution along, that making it happen, that doing all you can to make the revolution happen faster and quicker was a good thing. In other words, their position was, as was Marx's, if capitalism is bad, if capitalism is not good for the masses of the people, then let's get rid of it as quickly as we can. That, it turns out, is a major difference from Piketty. Piketty's analysis is somewhat similar to Marx's. The difference is that Piketty's agenda, Piketty's goal, is to suggest ways that capitalism can survive this. In other words, to suggest methodologies, to suggest solutions that society can take so that the worst evils of capitalism don't happen. What is the major difference between Piketty and Marx? It seems to me that the major difference is that Marx wants to see capitalism not make it. Piketty wants to see capitalism reformed so that it will make it. So in his analysis, Piketty resembles Marx quite a bit. The difference is what Piketty is doing is laying out the innards of capitalism in hopes that once people see it and once people begin to understand it, they will be able to make the kind of changes necessary to fix it and keep it alive and make it work better. And of course that, to Piketty, involves a very active government and the active support through tax policies and various other things of redistribution of wealth and income in such a way that the dire results of capitalism unregulated will not come to be. So Piketty's agenda, Piketty's goal, is to save capitalism. Marx's goal is to bring about or to predict or foresee the world that will come after capitalism dies out. We have now reached half past the hour. We have 1/2 hour left in our program. It is 2:30 in the East. We have 30 minutes, or a little bit less than that, to go. And if Bob Kincaid's at the horn there, and I'm going to take a very, very short break if we don't mind, just about 2 or 3 minutes if we could. and then I'll be right back here at the Virtual Center. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. We're going to take a very short break, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll be right back to complete today's program. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and thank you all very much for staying with us. I apologize. I had to take a short break for reasons that I'm sure everybody understands. As we get older, we can't go forever and ever without these periodic breaks. So I appreciate your tolerance and your willingness to go along. Usually we go right in our shorter Tuesday programs. We do the 90 minutes without the break. But today I was beginning to realize with a half an hour to go that this was not going to be possible. So I thank you for your tolerance and your indulgence. We have been into the writings of Piketty, Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital in the 21st Century. And I want to continue that for the rest of our program because I really believe this is so important. And so much of this is so important to all of us because much of it flies in the face of the rhetoric we hear all the time, the political rhetoric. In other words, the political world that we are living in today, it turns out, is so contradictory and so illusory, I guess is the word, in the face of the realities, the substantive economic realities that Piketty forces us to confront, that it is very important that we recognize the contradictions and that we act accordingly. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate on these issues directly with me, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. To this point, we've only scratched the surface here, and we'll get into it in more depth, I believe, in tomorrow's program. But mostly what we've done so far in relation to Thomas Piketty's book is to talk about the book, is to deal with Piketty from the outside looking in. Up to this point, we've done nothing that gets us into Piketty's research. In other words, what is it that Piketty is saying? The one thing that we have said that is substantive, I think, about Piketty's research is that Piketty's conclusion is that inequality, the inequality that all of us are confronting, all of us are aware of, and many of us are concerned about, the inequality is not separate from, but indeed a direct result of capitalism itself. Piketty's research has led him to conclude that inequality and capitalism go hand in hand. This is, of course, exactly what Karl Marx wrote 150 years ago. More than 100, almost 200 years ago. The difference, as we mentioned earlier, is that Marx supported the challenges to capitalism and basically looked forward to the day when capitalism would destroy itself and communism would replace it. Piketty, on the other hand, is doing his analysis of capitalism with the idea of saving it by laying out strategies or suggesting strategies to reform and to alleviate the most negative inequity associated with the development of capitalism. A number of publications have gone to work on Piketty's book. And it seems to me you can go to the internet and you can find any number of treatments of Piketty's analysis. Some of them lengthy, some of them abbreviated. I think it is very, very possible, and I'd like to do this if we can here at the Virtual Center in the little bit of time we have left in today's program, which is quite a bit less than a half an hour, less than 30 minutes. We've got about 25 minutes left, actually about 20 minutes left in today's program. One of the sources that I was able to come across I thought was very valuable and very helpful for its brevity is a treatment of Piketty's book that I found in The Economist. The Economist, of course, is a very reputable publication on economics. And The Economist features a review of Piketty's book Capital in 4 paragraphs. In other words, in 4 paragraphs, The Economist basically says, here's what we need to know about Piketty. This is what Piketty says. This is what Piketty proposes. And given the short time that we have in today's program, I thought this might be a good way to lay out the groundwork for what I think we can be addressing tomorrow in more depth. First of all, a little bit about Piketty's book from The Economist. Some of this we've dealt with before. The Economist says that Capital in the 20th Century is a book that is taking the world by storm. It was published in France in the year 2013 and in English in March of 2014. The English version quickly became a bestseller. It has prompted broad and energetic debate on the book's subject, which is the outlook for global inequality. Some believe that Piketty's book projects a pronounced shift in the focus of economic policy into what the Economist calls distributional questions. In other words, some people believe that the key to Piketty's book is the emphasis on redistribution of wealth and resources that will be necessary in order to short-circuit or to halt the progression toward the demise of democracy through rebellion that Piketty predicts if nothing is done. The Economists referred to Piketty as the modern Marx. Here's what the book is about. Capital, which is the title of the book, Capital in the 21st Century. Capital is built on more than a decade of research by Piketty and other economists, dealing with the historical changes in the concentrations of wealth and income over the last 2 centuries. This data, this pile of data, has produced and demonstrates the evolution of inequality since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th and 19th centuries, The Economist reports, Western European society was highly unequal. This is the 18th century, of course, is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Western Europe, prior to the Industrial Revolution, was extremely unequal, Piketty points out. Private wealth dwarfed national income and was concentrated in the hands of rich families, which sat atop a relatively rigid class structure. Traditional Western Europe was a class-structured society based on control by certain rich established families. The wealth was transmitted from generation to generation, and the laws that existed made that transfer of wealth from one generation to the next smooth and efficient, so that very little ever changed. Those people, those families, those names, which controlled society in one generation, continue to control it in the next, because the wealth and the power and the influence associated with this family's position was passed on generation to generation to generation. All of this was disrupted to a degree by the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution initiated the kind of change which made it possible for more and more larger and larger numbers of people to receive an income. As people began to work for money, for salaries, for wages, people were able to turn income into quality of life improvements. And as the Industrial Revolution went on and became bigger and bigger and more significant, more and more people were included in the industrial world, which was emerging in the late 18th and throughout the 19th centuries. The result was that income began to challenge established wealth for power. In England, for example, in the so-called civil wars of the 17th century, the struggles for power in the mid-17th century between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king, between the monarchy and the parliamentary legislature, what you find is that the real story behind that political struggle was the economic and social struggle underway between the emergent middle class associated with developing capitalism and the established landed class which traditionally controlled British society. And the same kind of struggles went on in the other nations, the other countries of Western Europe. So in a sense then, the emergence of capitalism was challenging tradition. And it was producing a whole new group of fantastically wealthy people, industrialists, who began to challenge the traditional landed aristocracy for power and influence. The power and influence of the middle classes, of the capitalist classes, was driven by income, not by established wealth. But those who were experiencing this fantastic increase in income demanded the influence and power that traditionally was associated with wealth. And in every society you had this clash. In England, in the middle of the 17th century, it produced the civil wars, which led to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which resulted in the preeminence of Parliament and the reduction of the absolute power of the monarchy. It redefined the role of the king into a much more symbolic, less active political role. And Parliament became, in essence, the governing body of capitalistic England going into the 18th century. So basically, this created this tension, if you will, between income and wealth, portended the changes associated with the development of capitalism, especially industrial capitalism. This system of rigid class structure resisted the forces of capitalism. it tended to persist even though industrialism contributed to rising wages for workers. All of this obviously was affected by the turmoil of the First World War and the Second World War in the 20th centuries, and by the Great Depression in the early 20th century, was disrupted the entire system of capitalism. High taxes, and this is from the Economist's account here of Piketty's book. High taxes, inflation, bankruptcies, and the growth of sprawling welfare states caused wealth to shrink dramatically and ushered in a period in which both income and wealth were distributed in relatively egalitarian fashion. This is what Piketty's research has enabled him to discover, to find data to support. That the First and the Second World Wars challenged the wealthy. It challenged the traditional status and position of wealth, of the great families, if you will. And the governments, in their efforts to address the challenges of war, and especially the challenges of the Great Depression, began to move in the direction of what we call today the welfare state. This began in Europe in the late 19th century under Bismarck in Prussia. And government began to step in and take care of people and provide the kind of social safety net that all of us are so familiar with today. The result of these changes, of the wars and of the Depression, the result was that traditional wealth was decimated. It was weakened considerably. Consequently, the power and influence of those with income began to challenge wealth. And so consequently, as we enter the first half of the 20th century, what we find is that income has become much more significant. Landed, established wealth has become less significant. And the result is that through income, more and more people are participating in the economy. Consequently, inequality is being reduced. As income goes up and wealth comes down, there's more equity, more balance, if you will. Inequality, which is generated by traditional capitalism, becomes less of a problem in the 20th century than ever before. As economic growth happens after the Second World War, as the economies of the Western world are recovering from the two world wars, inequality becomes less and less of a problem. The gap between rich and poor begins to close because economic growth, economic development is generating more and more income for more people. And it's allowing quality of life to increase for the many. On the other hand, the reduced influence of wealth is causing the political influence and power of wealth to diminish. The result being of all of this, that inequality is becoming less and less of an issue in the 20th century. This is Piketty's research. From this history, Piketty derives what he calls a grand theory of capitalism and inequality. As a general rule, Piketty says, wealth grows faster than economic output. Think about this. All things being equal, it is generally true that wealth grows faster than income, than economic output, than economic growth. And he reduces this to a formula. And his formula is expressed as R is greater than G. R is the rate of return to wealth. G is economic growth rate. So what Piketty is saying as an economist is that it is a general rule that the rate of return to wealth is greater than economic growth. Other things being equal, Piketty concludes, faster economic growth diminishes the importance of wealth in a society, whereas slower economic growth increases the power of that wealth. In other words, the more vibrant, the more dynamic, the more growing the economy is, the greater income becomes, and the less significant wealth becomes. Consequently, inequality is diminished. But when economic growth slows down, when economic activity slows down, then the influence of established wealth takes over, and it grows much faster. And consequently, the wealth takes over and grows much faster than the rate of economic growth or economic development. Piketty points out that there are no natural forces pushing against the steady concentration of wealth. There's no way to slow down the influence and the expansion of wealth. Economic growth, as long as it's vibrant, keeps it under control. But the minute economic growth slows down, the minute the economy slows, the influence of wealth becomes more and more prominent. And that means that inequality becomes greater and greater. The gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom becomes more and more pronounced. And Piketty says this is the nature of the animal. Only a burst of rapid growth from technological progress or rising population or government intervention can keep economies from returning to the traditional wealth-denominated societies that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution. Piketty calls this patrimonial capitalism. Patrimonial being obviously male-dominated, family-dominated wealth. This is the same process that Marx revealed. Piketty's solution is that only by intervening to stimulate growth can governments check the expansion of inequality. Only by taxing wealth, only by taxing income, only by redistributing the results of wealth and income in order to make it more equitable, can government control the inequality which the existence of wealth produces. This is Piketty's solution to the challenges of inequality. The reality is, as we know, that with the technological revolution that's going on now, with technology, with the internet, with the revolution in communications, with the birth of companies like Google and Amazon and all the rest of them, we are seeing this fantastic income that is being generated to the very few. But the fact of the matter is, as time goes on, this wealth and influence driven by income becomes established wealth, and it begins to generate its own inequality. In other words, there's a transition here from influence and power generated by fabulous income, there's a transition to the point where that income becomes established wealth. And it, through its investments, begins to generate its own wealth. And it begins to grow in and of itself, irrespective of whether the economy is moving or not. This is the process that government must control, Piketty says. This is why we need constructive progressive taxation in order to control the inequality which the establishment of wealth will produce. I know this is abstract. I know it's complex. I know it's confusing. But I think we'll see tomorrow, in tomorrow's program, the real world results of this process. We are being fed a mythological story about freedom from government taxation and about unregulated, uncontrolled, unregulated freedom. The fact of the matter is that in and of itself is generating the inequality which is going to bring the system down unless we do something about it. And that's where Piketty's research becomes significant. We have reached the end of our program today. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I apologize for the abstract nature of this. I understand it's complex. I understand it's difficult. And I understand my own limitations in trying to explain it, because this is something that I've wrestled with myself for a long time. It's very confusing. It's hard to grasp, but it is so important for the real decisions that it leaves for all of us. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to thank you for being with us today. We'll be back together again tomorrow. Be safe, and thank you.